On October 14th, 1945, a Soviet general stood before a vast crowd in a Pyongyang Stadium and introduced a national hero, a legendary guerrilla commander whose exploits against the Japanese had become folklore. The man who stepped forward was 33 years old, wearing a borrowed suit, reading a speech he could barely deliver because after years abroad, his Korean was failing. Some in the crowd whispered that this could not be the real Kim Il-sung. It did not matter. Moscow had chosen him. 80 years later, his grandson rules the same state with nuclear weapons. On August 15th, 1945, Japan's surrender abruptly ended 35 years of colonial rule in Korea. In the sudden power vacuum, Washington scrambled to establish a presence. Late at night in a Pentagon office, two junior U.S. officers, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were given 30 minutes to partition the peninsula. Using a National Geographic map of Asia, they drew a provisional line across the 38th parallel. The choice was entirely administrative, ignoring local geography, economy, and population. No Koreans were consulted. Unexpectedly, the Soviet Union accepted the proposal without objection. Within weeks, the Red Army occupied the northern territory, securing a strategic buffer zone. But to consolidate their control, Moscow needed a local proxy, a reliable, cooperative Korean leader who would owe his entire political existence to Soviet backing. Before he was a premier, he was Kim Song-ju, born to a peasant family in Monyeongdae in 1912. His family fled to Manchuria in his youth, where he joined Chinese-led anti-Japanese guerrilla units. In the late 1930s, he adopted the pseudonym Kim Il-sung, a name already associated with a legendary folk hero. While his unit's 1937 cross-border raid on a Japanese police station at Pochambo gained notoriety, Japanese military pressure eventually broke his network. By 1940, he fled into the Soviet Union. The Red Army placed him in the 88th Separate Rifle Brigade near Khabarovsk, commissioning him as a captain. It was here, in a Vyatskoye camp register, that his son's 1941 birth was recorded under the Russian name Yuri Irsenovich Kim, a direct contrast to the later state myth of a supernatural birth on Mount Pyektu. On September 19, 1945, this Red Army captain returned to Wonsan in Soviet uniform. On October 14, 1945, a crowd of over 100,000 gathered in Pyongyang's public stadium. Red Army General Ivan Chistiakov stepped forward to introduce the legendary anti-Japanese guerrilla hero Kim Il-sung. The audience expected a battle-hardened, grizzled veteran who had spent decades fighting in the mountains. Instead, they saw a 33-year-old man wearing a borrowed business suit. Speaking haltingly in a language he had not used regularly for years, he read a speech drafted entirely by Soviet political officers. Whispers filtered through the stadium that this young man was an imposter. Soviet internal security officers quickly noted the dissenters. These public doubts were systematically suppressed and criminalized. Within months, Kim was appointed chairman of the ruling party. By September 9, 1948, the Soviet Union formally proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Overnight, a former Red Army captain became the absolute ruler of 9 million people. On June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung sent his forces across the 38th parallel, launching a full-scale invasion of the South. This offensive was a calculated gamble. It became possible only after Stalin granted conditional approval in April, and Mao Zedong promised Chinese military support if American forces intervened. Kim expected a decisive victory within weeks. Instead, the conflict became a 3-year international catastrophe. The front lines swept down to the southern tip of the peninsula and back up toward the Chinese border twice, drawing global superpowers into direct confrontation. As the ground war ground to a stalemate, American bombing campaigns systematically leveled nearly every city, town, and industrial center in the north. The human toll was immense. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers and over 130,000 South Korean troops died. In the north, Military deaths are estimated between 415,000 and 520,000, alongside millions of civilian casualties across the peninsula. On July 27, 1953, the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement halted active combat almost exactly where it had begun. No formal peace treaty was ever signed. The division of the peninsula froze along a heavily fortified demilitarized zone. For Kim, the devastation did not undermine his fragile legitimacy. It transformed his installed regime into a permanent emergency state, cementing absolute internal control under the perpetual threat of renewed conflict. The destruction of the war provided the pretext for a systematic cleansing of the party's ranks. Between 1955 and 1960, Kim Il-sung eliminated the witnesses of his rise. First, the domestic communists who had operated inside Korea during colonial rule were arrested and executed. Next, the regime targeted Soviet-aligned ethnic Koreans, removing the direct links to Moscow's wartime patronage. Finally, veterans who had fought alongside Chinese forces were purged. By the early 1960s, no public figure remained who could challenge the official narrative of Kim's life. With his rivals gone, the state systematically rewrote history. School textbooks and public monuments erased the Red Army's role in the 1945 liberation, crediting the victory solely to Kim's mythical Korean People's Revolutionary Army. The state replaced orthodox Marxism-Leninism with Juche, an ideology of self-reliance that placed the Kim family at the center of the political universe. To enforce this absolute conformity, the regime established the Songbun system. This hereditary caste structure divided the population into core, wavering, and hostile classes based on ancestors' political loyalty, dictating access to food, education, and employment. The former Red Army captain was gone, replaced by an unchallengeable, deified liberator. Tens of thousands of monuments were erected across North Korea, establishing a personality cult that exceeded those of Stalin and Mao. By 1966, the regime made wearing a leader badge mandatory for all adults, placing Kim's image over every heart. The state even restructured time, dating the official calendar from 1912, the year of his birth. On July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung died after nearly 50 years in power. He had outlasted Stalin, Khrushchev, Mao, and the Soviet Union itself. In December, Kim Jong-il formally assumed control, completing the first hereditary succession in the communist world. This transition coincided with the arduous march, a catastrophic famine during which the regime denied the crisis and concealed food shortages. Demographers estimate the resulting death toll ranges from several hundred thousand to over 1 million people. The system sustained itself through the crisis, eventually passing power to Kim's grandson, Kim Jong-un, in 2011. Subscribe for more stories like this. Kim Jong-un secured his position as the latest guardian of the bloodline through calculated internal violence. In December 2013, he ordered the execution of his uncle and regent, Jang Song-thaek. 4 years later, his exiled half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, was assassinated with a VX nerve agent in a Malaysian airport. Beyond family purges, the regime relies on its ultimate insurance policy, a nuclear weapons program first tested in October 2006. These strategic weapons, paired with total state isolation, preserve a system structurally frozen in time. The theatrical mass display at the Pyongyang Stadium in October 1945 became a permanent governing system. Today, the manufactured legitimacy of a former Red Army captain still dictates the survival of the dynasty. Subscribe for more stories like this. What began as a temporary, foreign-engineered project has hardened into a permanent, nuclear-armed reality. Today, millions remain captive to a dynasty built on a manufactured past, proving that some political illusions are remarkably difficult to shatter. Subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries.